Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Alyssa Mielene. I am a journalist at Devex and thrilled to have you here today at this Devex Pro briefing. Um, Goodness, it's been quite a year for foreign aid. We all know that very, very well. The world's largest aid agency, USAID, has been hollowed out. Countries across Europe, the UK, and France have cut their foreign assistance budgets too. And from where we sit, it's felt like nothing in that kind of crazy array of events has happened quietly. At least here in the US, it was something that was sometimes applauded by people in the country. And repeatedly, we saw politicians use criticisms of waste and fraud and abuse to cut away foreign aid. And at least from the outside looking in, it kind of felt like those messages resonated. I think for many people in the sector, it's caused a bit of an inflection point of how the public thinks about aid, how they talk about aid, what they really feel about this work that so many people in the DevEx audience are part of. Um, and to help us unpack all those questions and to better understand what the reality is behind them, we have brought in an incredible expert to dig in further. I'm pleased to introduce everyone to Patrick Flynn. He is the data journalist at Focaldata, which is a research firm based in the United Kingdom. And Patrick is here to tell us all about Focaldata's recent research, which really gets into these particular questions. What does the public think about aid? What are the public perceptions across the world? And where do we kind of go from here once we unpack all of that? Focal data has done some really, really interesting research that I'm excited to get into with everyone. But before we get started, I just want to thank Patrick for joining us here today at this DevEx Pro briefing. Patrick, welcome.
Thanks for having me. Hi, everyone.
So, everyone, we would love to have this be a conversation. I'll be asking Patrick questions, but if you do have questions of your own, please do drop them into the chat or into the Q&A, and I'll do my best to take your questions, pose them to Patrick, and we can have as much of a fluid conversation as possible. I know that folks are continuing to trickle in, and that's great. As our team mentioned, feel free to introduce yourself and talk amongst the chat. So, all of that being said, let's dive and dig right in. Patrick, Focal Data recently researched this question: what does the public think about aid? And to do that, they conducted a four-country survey. You covered UK, US, France, and Germany. Give me the highlights. What did you find?
Yeah, it's a good intro to the research. Yes, we kind of wanted to look kind of historically because it's very easy to kind of come from this point of cuts in the US and cuts in the UK and just assume that it's just happened out of nowhere. We wanted to kind of look historically about how the kind of decline in support for aid has happened. So I think someone in the chat asked which countries. It was the UK, the US, France, and Germany. Um, but yeah, we kind of argue in the piece that the decisions that have been taken by governments follow a kind of direction of travel, which we think has been kind of clear for a long time for those of us that have been working in the public opinion sector. So I think, yeah, in other words, these aren't isolated shocks, but maybe part of a broader pattern of changing public opinion as well as ideological shifts as well. I think the positive thing about this is that overseas aid does sit on a kind of bedrock of goodwill with there's broad support for aid in principle. But the kind of negative thing we found is that support is collapsing as a result of several kind of covariating factors like zero-sum thinking. We kind of get into that a little bit in the piece. Distrust of elites, which is kind of impacting the aid sector as well. Political polarization and kind of who, when you look at it kind of from a political science perspective, who the main presidential candidates are kind of going for, which kinds of voters they want. And we found that those swing voters are now much more likely to be opposed to aid as opposed to the swing voters as they might have existed 10, 15 years ago, as well as some of the kind of divisive political issues that aid and things like climate change as well have managed to end up getting themselves entangled in, which is kind of making aid a bit less resistant to changes in government across different ideologies. But yeah, we also studied messages around aid, whether that be the actual ad content that could be used in an aid message, or even just the name of what do we call ODA, like what else should we call it? And even then, we found some pretty large differences when it came to public support among those different concepts. Yeah, excited to get into it, but like generally messages focused on the basics. So whether it's like clean water, food, healthcare, all fare the best. And when aid is framed in a way of cooperation or security or emergency humanitarian aid, just like the core kind of human emotions, things which will save lives, support tends to rise as well.
Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, I mean, I've encouraged folks, and we'll post a link on Focaldata's website where you can find this report. But I think there's a lot of really interesting pieces to to kind of pull at here. I mean, the first and foremost, as you said, Patrick, you found that overseas aid has become just much more divisive, and that it is more divisive. Across a number of different demographics. Can you talk to me a little bit about that? I mean, what were the different demographics that you looked at, and how did that perception change based on the demographic group?
Yeah, so what we did is performed like segmentation, not to like bore everyone with the like stats, but like it's called a principal component analysis, which kind of looks at the things which are driving differences between different groups. And we ended up guessing about six groups. It was six groups, yeah. So authoritarian populists, which is kind of like Trump support base, really. Progressive internationalists, which is kind of probably the most left-wing group. What we've called the distrustful left, which is kind of the what's sometimes called the old left. It's those people that traditionally have voted for left of center parties, but are now kind of being increasingly drawn to the populist right. We've had techno optimists, which is people who are very trusting of other people and very pro things like AI, climate action, things like that. Civic centrists, which is basically the cluster like right in the middle, and then what we call community conservatives, which are like the right of center people who are a bit more moderate in some of their views. And we kind of found that the gap in support for overseas aid among those different segments has grown enormously, even in the past 10 to 15 years. So we basically asked people about their historic positions on overseas aid, and even among the least supportive groups, around 40% of people still supported overseas aid, which is a very good position for any kind of any campaign to be in. But when we look at today, it's 15% among the lowest segment. So the kind of gap between the most supportive and the least supportive segments has grown from 33 points about 10 to 15 years ago, and it's now at 60. So it's basically doubled. And yeah, that's causing a lot of problems for the sector.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. And I think something interesting to point out that I noticed in the research is even among those who felt supportive of foreign aid or skeptical of its future effectiveness. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, we did find that as well. So let me try and find that. Yeah, so it's only about half of people who think ODA has been very effective in the last 30 years remain very confident that it will be effective in the next 30 years, which is quite a worrying place to be in. Because when you look at people who are less supportive of ODA, they're much more likely to still have fixed opinions. If they think it wasn't successful before, they still think it won't be successful going forward. So that I think it kind of paints the picture of how support is kind of declining, even among some of the groups which we think should be the most supportive.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's also a pretty interesting piece here, which is the fact that this kind of translates to spending, right? Or what people
Yeah.
want or believe the government should be spending money on. This is something we've looked a lot at as we've reported on the kind of crumbling of US aid this year. But I believe the most recent data shows it was something like 0.02% or 0.2% of GNI or the gross national income. And it kind of creates this idea of perception versus reality of what the government is spending its money on, right? Talk to me a little bit about that and how that translates in the countries that you saw.
Yeah, it's interesting. We find something very similar in the UK. Like, generally, people are very bad at estimating what the government spends money on. I think there was a piece of research done in the UK a few years ago where, like, some of the top things people thought the government spends money on, well, like overseas aid was one of them, and like MPs' salaries, so like legislators' salaries, which is like 0.001% of GDP. People estimate it's like 20% or something ridiculously high. So people are kind of not very good at kind of assessing where the government is spending money. And I guess if they get the perception that something is being spent on something that they don't think is valid or a good use of money, it's very difficult to kind of recover from that situation. You kind of need to counter it quite aggressively. Or when it comes to like overseas aid specifically as well, we kind of looked at where, which not just whether people think money is spent on aid, but kind of where in the aid sector people think that money is being spent, and then where they want it to be spent. So if you kind of look at a almost like a two by two of like think versus want, you kind of want to be in that like top right sector. So you want to be in a place where people think a lot of aid money is spent there, and people want a lot of aid money to be spent there. So if we kind of look in that top right corner, we've got things like water and sanitation, disaster relief, healthcare, and vaccines. So those are places where people want aid to be spent, and also places where people think aid is spent. The kind of more difficult place to be is kind of in the bottom right corner, where people think aid is spent somewhere but don't want it to be spent there. So things like costs of hosting refugees, for example, particularly in Europe, it was a bit less pointed in the US, but particularly in Europe, things like direct cash transfers to foreign politicians. A majority of people still think that aid money goes directly to foreign politicians, which is damaging the sector. And likewise, things like international space exploration. I'm not sure if that's something that you see in the US, but in the UK, there's this kind of like meme where people think that aid is being spent on India's space program. Um, I didn't think it was very common that people believed this, but then when we actually did some more qual research, quite a lot of people actually brought that specific case up, which is quite interesting. And I think it definitely also speaks to the kind of fragmentation of our media consumption, and it being much more difficult to kind of get on top of what people are actually viewing and what people are being told.
So interesting. So it points to that kind of the misinformation piece, but also just folks probably not fully understanding, which I think is a great segue into the messaging element of it all, right? You mentioned kind of the things that people want versus don't want money to be spent on. But sometimes that is just a matter, right, in terms of how you frame a lot of this. I mean, talk to me a little bit about that. What type of language, Patrick, did you see hit the public the most in terms of like, oh, that makes sense. We want to support that. And what hit folks the least?
Yeah, so like even going at the very like fundamental level of what we even call overseas aid, how we frame that language. And when we kind of tested all of these different, we did one, two, three, four, five, we did about 10 different framings of ODA, from emergency humanitarian assistance, official development assistance, foreign aid, global investment, things like that, just kind of seeing where people sat. And there was quite a big gap between support, even for this, say, it's the same concept, it's just framed in a different way. So ODA, someone has asked in the chat, over official development assistance, yes. Yeah, so official development assistance got about 35% of the public had a positive view of it. You go down the list and you see things like global justice payments is the lowest, like the idea that aid should be kind of retribution for things that have happened in the past. Like that's not particularly common outside of the kind of most left leaning voter groups. But whereas we go to the top of the list and we can see things like emergency humanitarian assistance gets 47% compared to 35% for ODA, development cooperation, and international security assistance as well. And those three that I've listed are also helpfully some of the least divisive concepts that we tested. So having a position where a concept is both well supported but also more resistant to the kind of growing polarization and fragmentation, I think is very much a position that the aid sector will want to get in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, and I don't know if the report of the data shows this, but why do you think these certain terms hit right? And why do you feel like things like global justice payments hit wrong?
I think it's strangely, it feels like the framings that are most kind of like, to use it for lack of a better term, like center right framings are typically the best. I think we basically find that those perhaps more distrustful or socially conservative people are much more change their minds a lot depending on what the concept is. So, like things like global justice payments, which seem perhaps a bit more explicitly left coded are basically drive down support among those kinds of groups, or like framing that seems a bit more perhaps academic. Um, Whereas, yeah, focusing on the basics, on humanitarian assistance, on security, and basically looking at how aid can also help the donor country is very, very important. Like there's been a lot of research across not just the aid sector, but across a lot of different sectors on the growth of what's called zero sum thinking. So this idea that if somebody else gets richer, it means that I'm getting poorer. And by extension, if I'm giving money to a different country, it means that my country is getting poorer and that country is doing better than me. I mean that's it's one of the key things to like Trump's rhetoric, like this idea of zero sum, and we see that growing across the West. Particularly, it's there's been a lot of research on it, and it is linked to the kind of level of GDP growth that somebody experiences in childhood. So you see that when you've got kind of lower levels of economic growth sustained over 20, 30 years, you will be able to see that level of zero sum thinking growing. So kind of framings around aid that can counter that and make the argument that aid is also good for the donor country is perhaps the one of the things that we would recommend doing.
Great. And we do have two questions in the chat, Patrick, for you. The first, I don't remember this from the research whether or not, are the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Did you look at that? Is that part of the framing options? And the second one is, what does this mean for human rights narratives, like right holders, duty bearers? To me, from the get-go, this seems like a little bit more perhaps of that niche development term and sometimes can be jargony. But I would be curious what you think about that. But first, let's do SDGs and then human
Yeah,
rights.
so we did look at sustainability, and like I'm very much a pro like environment person, but like that was one of the most divisive framings, international sustainability initiatives. Again, it's kind of what we also looked in this piece about climate change and net zero as well. And we found that, yeah, climate change is kind of going the same way as ODA has over the past like 20, 30 years in becoming a lot more divisive. So that kind of perfect blend of ODA plus climate change is getting quite a divisive result. On human rights, I can't remember if we actually tested that one. As far as I'm aware, we didn't. I mean, it's been a few months since we did the research. Let me double check. Uh, I don't think we actually did. I mean, I wish I had more on that one for you, but unfortunately, we don't. Yeah,
Perhaps.
I'll double check and see if we've done research on that, and I can get back to whoever's asked that question after the webinar if that's useful.
Yeah. I mean, and I would be curious what your overall reactions would be to this, Patrick, but this type of the kind of the terms that Bridget has used, right holders, duty bearers, I mean, it does seem
Mm,
like this perhaps might be more of a, uh, one like development terms that perhaps don't translate outward in the public. I mean, this is something, again, I think we had a story a couple of months ago that really looked at this, like what does the development world use to communicate out? And are people or are they not really picking up on that? And I think that's a tricky thing that a lot of people are realizing that like perhaps they're not, right? These terms
yeah,
that
it's
we're
like
so used to in these sectors are not very translatable.
yeah. I mean, it's very much the risk that kind of comes with like sectors like this of becoming very insular and kind of speaking to kind of other people in our sector as opposed to the general public, and kind of yeah, reframing that is very, very important. Kind of just going from first principles and realizing like yeah, these are the people that we need to target. How do they speak? Yeah, I think it's a common issue that the kind of yeah the left or any kind of left coded things have had in recent years.
Yeah. And I think just to throw
Yeah.
out a couple of terms from Patrick's work that did kind of stick out to me at least were these academic framings that there is how you
Mm,
described it in the piece, which is things like decolonizing aid. These types of terms ranked lower, if I'm remembering correctly, right, Patrick?
yeah, that's correct. Yeah, yeah, decolonizing aid was among the kind of lower tier of results when we came to the actual like ad testing. Things on like yeah, small boat refugees as well, like in in Europe. Again, this is more of a European context, but yeah, three-quarters of the research was done in Europe. But yeah, that doesn't fare particularly well either. And yeah, it's those messages focused on the basics, communicated in a clear and quite simple way, are surprisingly, yeah, just the most effective.
Right. Right. And I think there's kind of two ways to look at this, right? It's how to message and it's how to work. And we have, again, like you said, emergency humanitarian assistance. That seemed to work best. Um, Organizations perhaps that provide that humanitarian assistance, that basic need, kind of food, water, healthcare, disaster relief. I believe it was Medicine Sans Frontiers that had kind of on this ranking of many different organizations, kind of the most trusted. And I know there is a caveat, Patrick, that you can explain
Yeah.
about the French aspect, but curious if you can go into that a little bit and what you think is happening there, whether it be messaging or work, or maybe it's a combination of both.
Yeah, I think it's yeah. So just to like summarize, we basically tested favorability alongside trust to deliver aid across a number of different both people, governments, and organizations. So we tested five different organizations. So yeah, Médecins Sans Frontières, UNICEF, Save the Children, WaterAid, Oxfam. We looked at the kind of benevolent billionaires, so everyone from Bill Gates to Jeff Bezos. And then we looked at people's own government and the European Union as well. And almost universally, we find that it's those kind of charities and NGOs really that are have the highest level of favorability among the public and simultaneously are most trusted to deliver overseas aid. On the MSF front, it's 25% of this survey was done in France, so it's probably not surprising that a French audience might be a lot more favorable towards a French organization than an organization that's based outside of France. So that's kind of driven the net favorability for that up. But it kind of I think it also does speak to the kind of wider point that people very much trust doctors and nurses, and they will trust what they're saying, what they are doing in terms of saving lives and delivering this assistance much more than billionaires. I think this kind of billionaire favorability aspect, Bill Gates is the only billionaire that we tested that actually has a net favorable rating. Some more people view him favorably than unfavorably. I think if we'd have asked this 20 years ago, we would have probably not as favorable as the organizations, but more favorable than we see currently. So it's this kind of anti-elite sentiment that has kind of leaked into the culture in the last 15, 20 years, particularly since the financial crisis in 2008, which, yeah, again, the aid sector needs to make sure that it's kind of reframing who is giving these messages.
Yeah. Now, quite a number of questions have come in through the chat, and some of them we can just answer in terms of the quick hits. There's a couple of questions about Tasha has just asked about 25% respondents were in France. As Patrick mentioned earlier in the call, the other countries were Germany, UK, and US. And then, Patrick, there's also a question for you just in terms of the sampling method and kind of the geographic spread, which I've just answered. But if you can perhaps just go into that a little bit to answer this question from Greg.
Yeah, of course. So we had 3,200 respondents across, yeah, UK, US, France, and Germany. And yeah, the data was weighted across a bunch of different demographics to ensure that we had a, a representative group of respondents. So we looked at age, gender, region, education, ethnicity in the UK and US, and then political interest levels as well is one of the things that we think is quite important to getting those kind of people who are less likely to take surveys into our world of our results. Yeah.
Great. And now that that's cleared, just kind of, I have a couple questions about what works, and I think that might start to answer some of the questions that have been put in the chat. But really, we've talked about, okay, food, water, humanitarian assistance, et cetera. Where do you think we go from here? I mean, where does the aid sector go next, and how do they kind of take in what you've just said, what you've just explained, and kind of reshift messaging, reshift priorities to kind of speak more to the public in the future?
Yeah, I think it's kind of twofold. Like on the one hand, like one of the biggest recommendations we have is to go back to basics and look at the fundamentals of what aid is delivering and what is popular among the public, especially in an era where support is basically at risk very much. Obviously, the UK government has kind of joined the US, and we haven't scrapped aid altogether, but it's being reduced to 0.3% of GDP. Even 20, 25 years ago, that would have been pretty unthinkable. But yeah, like going back to the kind of concepts of basic humanitarian needs, and yeah, like recalibrating the approach to kind of depoliticize where possible. Like we live very much in an era of like hyper polarization across the Western world. So yeah, go back to basics, depoliticize, focus on fundamental human needs, rebuild trust, and also I think in a way like it's this isn't about going back to the messaging of the 1990s because that's just not something that will work, especially in today's kind of media era. One of the interesting things that's it's not in the piece, but I would say is perhaps there's even a way to almost take advantage of this kind of growing fragmentation and polarization of media consumption and realize that aid does not have to be a kind of one size fits all approach. There can be different ways to frame aid in different ways for different groups without, even other groups having to even see those framings. You could still have framings for kind of progressives that are focused around sustainability and things like that. Whereas when you look at people who might be a bit more skeptical, you can still deliver messages which are, framed around security or benefiting the host country and yeah, things like that.
Great. Patrick, a couple of things. Anthony has asked about the United Nations, its development agencies, and whether that was something that you looked at. And Mark has asked about faith traditions and communities. I'm curious if you have any takes on that, given the research.
Yeah, I don't think we looked at the UN as one of the groups we did favorability for. What was the other question? Sorry, who asked this one?
Mark has asked, do you have any insight on how people of different faith traditions are viewing international aid, including different traditions within the Christian community?
Yeah, that's very much an interesting one. I'm not sure if the data might have been collected. It's typically, I think in some countries you have difficulties asking questions like this because in things on religion and ethnicity are a bit more taboo to ask in surveys in some of the European countries as opposed to kind of the UK and US. It definitely would be interesting to look at. I will actually see if we can pull that out of the data after this.
Yeah, I think it's a really both of those are really interesting
Yeah,
questions.
yeah, yeah.
Mark's, I don't know, but it's something that I feel like now I would like to look into it as well. For Anthony, I can provide a bit of response to that, not based on this particular work, but based on something I heard at the UN General Assembly. So Gallup did a study, just kind of looking at how the public perceives the United Nations, how they perceive the United Nations effectiveness. And just pulling up my notes from that session, they found that 32% of Americans approve of the UN's performance, and that's a 41% drop from when the institution was founded 80 years ago. Now, those are just the early findings. The Gallup is doing a global look and going to be releasing this. I believe it's either late this year or early next year. But that was kind of quite a shocking stat. They went through, so far, they've gone through about 40 countries to kind of expand that research out wider and presented these early findings at the UNGA. And it was a bit better. 50% of people in those 40 nations approved of the UN's work. And in an interesting way, kind of the countries that are most known for receiving development assistance scored the highest, but those who were in conflict often scored the UN the lowest. So I'll post that in the chat, the story that we wrote on that. It's pretty interesting, kind of goes into bits and pieces of why that might be. And also they look across age brackets. So they found that Gen Z was actually much more optimistic about the institution than others. And I'm dropping that right here. Cool. So we've got a bunch more questions. Damien has asked Patrick, the UK was early in the shift away from clear support to foreign aid by doing away with the Department for International Development in 2020. We might have missed the warning signs there in terms of realigning the way we talk about aid. Curious how that kind
Yeah.
of hits you.
No, I think that's very much the case, and that's a very good point. I think yeah, as we kind of say in the white paper, this is not it's not something that has appeared overnight. It's very much been the case over the course of the course of the century. Really, we kind of look back to. I mean, I remember like as a child, like in 2005, when you had all these like you had the Make Poverty History, you had the Live Aid, all these kind of big kind of events where the entire country was kind of watching and participating, and that kind of it's just something like that seems pretty unthinkable, I think, in today's day and age, especially like everyone coming together to kind of help out a different country or like a different group of people just doesn't seem very viable. So yeah, I think it's not something. It's not as if that just overnight became counter to what the kind of dominating factors in the culture. But yeah, it's been declining for a while.
Yeah, and given that, and given the fact that again, I think you used the word crumbling in your
Yeah.
research. Sarah asks a really, I think, important question. She says, is reframing our work as less politicized or more basic too high of a risk to compromise our moral code, an attraction of younger generations who want more genuine and deeper solutions to poverty and inequality? I think that's a really hard question, Sarah. I would be curious what Patrick thinks or what other folks in the chat think. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's especially if you look up across generations, right? And or perhaps Patrick across those demographic groups that you mentioned at the top of the call. It's a tough
Yeah,
one.
I mean, it's obviously a difficult question, but I guess you have to look at ask difficult questions about what aid is for. Like, obviously, it makes people feel good to like deliver aid, but if you're not kind of getting the level of support among the public that allows you to do that, it's a different question. I think there are ways to communicate aid internally, and I think that's probably the route to kind of recruiting people. Like we're doing good, we're doing all these things to help the environment, to help people in different countries. Whereas, yeah, how that's communicated to the public is probably something that should be a different question.
Yeah, it's kind of a maybe it's a I don't know if I don't think I would go so far as to say it's a necessary evil, but it is kind
Mm,
of what's necessary, right?
yeah,
I think often in the US, even before President Trump returned to the White House, there was a lot of talk here in Washington about aid as a national security tool. The way it was framed was kind of really always looking at that because when push comes to shove, many taxpayers would not be interested in having their money go abroad for X, Y, or Z reason, and they would prefer it to stay at home, right? Whether or not they realize how little of that money is actually going into foreign aid is another question. But I think perhaps there's no choice in this day and age about rethinking how to reframe or rethinking how to deliver or give aid. Um,
yeah, yeah. And I mean, sometimes that kind of strays into like framings that would be very like uncomfortable, like for some of us and probably many of us in well, many of you in the aid sector and things like migration. Like we asked one question in the survey about whether people would be comfortable with a higher aid budget if it meant lower levels of migration to the country, and like a plurality of people like supported it. So it's kind of yeah, it's kind of coming up with ways that you can target different groups of voters with different framings, even if that might be, uncomfortable to your own kind of politics. It's yeah, perhaps as you say, it is a necessary evil of getting things done.
yeah. Anything that you would say, Patrick, to John's questions? He's asking about that framing in terms of global public goods, addressing global problems. Did that resonate with folks, do you think? I do wonder if making a problem global then creates a lack of responsibility for one actor, but I would be curious what you think about that.
Yeah, that's possible. I mean, in general terms, like people are quite positive towards the idea of kind of cooperation and yeah, still working with other people. So I don't think it's necessarily something that is necessarily a bad thing. But yeah, I think it's difficult because like there's a question of trying to change the culture and a question of fitting within the current culture. Like the aid sector can only do so much to kind of change the overall political sphere. and whether, yeah, it's a debate in a lot of sectors as to whether you kind of go down which avenue you go down. But yeah, I think obviously with the kind of growing levels of nationalism and kind of individual country focused policies and views people have, perhaps that's not the best way to go. Perhaps not the best route to go down with certain groups. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, Such interesting stuff here, Patrick. What's next for Focaldata for your work? Are you going to be revisiting this across more countries? Are you going to be looking at different questions related to aid and overseas development?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, yeah, we do a lot of work with NGOs and in the kind of charity sector. We did actually a different team, but we did publish recently a big, I think it was 45 country study with Rockefeller on international cooperation. So the person that asked that question will probably be very interested. I think let me hang on. I can share that in the chat. Yeah, so it was global views on international cooperation with 36,000 people in 34 countries. Yes, that was with Rockefeller. It's very much worth a read, I think. Yeah, I've just posted that in the chat for anyone who's interested.
Fabulous. Can you give us the broad strokes while we have you?
I didn't work on the report, so I wish I could, but unfortunately, I probably can't at this stage. But yeah, basically, like generally speaking, people are in favor of cooperation. But yeah, I think it's one of those things where people are less kind of a bit more skeptical about whether it has actually been delivered. And yeah, belief in delivery or lack thereof is one of the things that can alter support among the public.
For sure, for sure. I mean, I think it goes back to this question as well. Where is money? One, is it going to the right places? Is it actually delivering? I mean, I think that is why there's a lot of different conversations and questions about things like outcome-based aid, or can we deliver in a different way, right? Are we, past the point of just putting money in different problems, and then what is the tracking like? Now, I will say, I think USAID's tracking system, from my reporting, has shown that it was really kind of the most developed of at least the US agencies that deliver aid
Yeah.
in many ways. So how the State Department will kind of figure out how to do that, I know is something that folks that I'm talking to in DC are a little concerned about. But it will be interesting to see how that plays, right? And whether perhaps this is a point of discussion or something to think about for aid agencies is that transparency element. I know there's a big push in the UK and the US with organizations that are saying, publish, publish, publish your data, and we need to know where the money is going, what it's being spent on, and whether those things actually work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've done like qualitative research on this as well, and that is one of the common themes that we find among people who are not necessarily opposed to aid, but are opposed to how it's currently being used, is that people are very skeptical about where the money is going, and in many cases think that we don't actually know where the money is going. Whether it's just going to like line the pockets of, as I said before, of foreign politicians or going on, vanity projects and things like that. That's one of the things that can perhaps maybe somewhat of an easy win to kind of drum up some more public support.
Fabulous. All right, I will take one more question. And I see that there is a question from Anthony here. Taking the point on basic needs as easier to sell, how can development activity, such as building up capacity of national health and education systems, or international cooperation on climate and natural disasters, be best approached? And the way that I see that question, and why I think it's an interesting one, is how do we get some of this weedy development jargon style programs public support? Is there a way to do that when you're thinking? I mean, I think that the term capacity building is such a development one where I don't think any general person outside of our space would be thrilled to fork up dollars for that. So I'm curious what you think,
Yeah.
Pat.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's about audiences. Like speaking to people in the sector, like absolutely go for it. But like, yeah, the vast majority of the public are not really going to understand what that is, and kind of whether that is through working with like comms agencies or PR people to kind of figure out the best way to advertise what it is, like all the good work that everyone is doing in the best way to the public. It is, I mean, it's vital at the moment because it's not as if we live in an era where support is like dropping a little bit, but it's still broadly supported. Like it is very much in a kind of crisis point where it could potentially disappear altogether. This idea of overseas aid over the next few decades. Yeah.
Fabulous. Great. Well, I will cut us off here now. I know the questions are still flowing in, and I'm sorry to do so. But in the meantime, I would encourage everyone to check out Focal Data's research. Check out the link that I've just posted that Patrick has shared with Rockefeller. And looking forward to having more conversations like these to really look at, okay, what does the aid sector do? What's next? What needs to change? Thank you, Patrick, so much for joining us today.
Right. Thanks for having me, and thanks everyone.